Today, we're going to go over the importance of supply chain for business resilience. Supply chain will definitely be a topic that will or should be on your minds, and it has really taken center stage on a global scale for many reasons. So we'll dig into that. We're going to start off with the basics, just so that we certainly know what it is that we're talking about. So, what is third-party supply chain? Um, Effectively, it is any company, system, or service that you employ and that your business relies on to operate, right? So while it's typically represented as a chain or a line in this case, um, we'll go into exactly what that means, how these things connect together, and what the sort of impact zone would be within third-party supply chain, and how that does impact your business. And then we'll go into what it is that you can actually do to sort of prepare yourself and be resilient against third-party supply chain risks. Um, but yeah, so we're looking at your care home. We'll look at software vendors, so any sort of technology that you employ within your organization. Looking at cloud providers, if you think of things like your email, Teams, if you're a Microsoft house, it could be Google Suite, whatever it is, would fall into that. Your logistics and suppliers, and then all the way down to the NHS or government portals that you may interact with. All of that makes up your third-party supply chain. But really it's more like a grouping of suppliers, right? So if we don't think of it as a chain where it's going to start right at the end and make its way towards you, it's rather this collection of organizations that might share suppliers, but it is centered around your care home and what matters to you most to deliver the services that you do. But it is quite critical to understand that when any of these companies are breached, and even if you think of one of your suppliers, they'll have suppliers of their own. And these breaches that are seemingly worlds apart from your organization directly can actually have an impact directly on your organization, whether that be operational, reputational, financial. There are a number of different considerations that you have to take into mind when considering your supply chain and what risks are involved therein. Um, there is a regulatory landscape that is set out by governments and different bodies. And we kind of break that down. There's a couple of really important ones that we have on the screen at the minute, some set in the best practice space. So ISO as a standard is definitely a best practice. Just make sure that you're gearing yourself up for, taking the base principles and making sure that they're applied within your organization to stay secure, right? Looking after the sensitive critical data that you will be handling on a day-to-day. There are a number of these that are also in force at the minute. So Cyber Essentials, Cyber Essentials Plus. I'm really hoping that for everyone on the call today, Cyber Essentials isn't a new term or a new word that's been thrown out. It really is the foundational basis for cybersecurity preparedness for organizations. And I would definitely say if you haven't gone down the route of looking at Cyber Essentials, even from a self-assessment standpoint, which is a zero cost effort, certainly do so, and then step into what they call Cyber Essentials Plus, which is just a audited version of that. So there will be a small cost associated, but you do get the stamp that you are definitely doing at least the ground floor basics that you should be doing as an organization. We have got others like DORA, NIS2. These are other directives that do support, depending on the size of your organization. Certainly, something like NIS2 is very highly recommended. And then we've got the looming UK Cyber Resilience Act. And that is, we have it listed as coming in May. It's probably coming a little bit later down the line. But the cyber bill itself is going to enforce quite a lot of requirements across the industry that aren't currently explicitly enforced. So, people that haven't looked at Cyber Essentials, for example, it's going to be an absolute requirement that you start at that point and start building up these sort of proof points that you are taking the sort of security of your digital realm as seriously as you need to. But that is looking at the regulatory landscape. There's always changes, always updates to these as the years go on. So something to just keep in your mind. But let's look at why this matters to your care home, right? And we spoke about some of the impacts, looking at operational, commercial, reputational. You know, if you think about the operational impact for your organization, if one of your suppliers is locked out of their ability to deliver the services back to you, you know, that can have a detrimental impact to your operations on a day-to-day, right? A breach or a lockout of a financial system, for example, means that you're unable to get access to those accounts, right? You may be unable to pay your staff. You know, there are such big knock-on effects that sometimes when people start looking at and unpacking what supply chain and third-party supply chain risk could look like to your organization, it tends to fall into one of two camps. One, that it seems so far away that it isn't a direct impact to you, or it's one that it just seems too all-encompassing that just about anything can trip you up. And while it could be a combination of both those things, there is certainly a lot that you can do on the ground to ensure that you have the resilience to carry on as a business in the face of any impacts that can happen to your supply chain and what you deliver to your customers, and particularly in your industry, you know, your patients and the care that's involved in that and the type of information that gets shared is extremely critical, and you really want to ensure that you're able to deliver on all the outcomes that are expected from you. And reputational impact is one of those that I'm pretty sure in your industry is a fairly big factor, where you know, if you're painted as a you know, not a great organization to do business with, it really does impact how you get to sort of conduct yourselves out there and what type of business you get to retain or attract. So we'll look at what these risks could look like from a cybersecurity standpoint, right? If a supply systems are hacked and they're unable to deliver service to you, whether that be food deliveries or you know, think of any of the basics that come through your supply chain. If their systems are locked out and they are digitally running their business, there's a good chance that they're not going to be able to fulfill their requirements back onto you. Operationally, if that organization that was impacted actually goes out of business, you know, the questions that you would have to ask are, do you have a backup? Is there somebody else that you can approach to get the same type of service or facilities? You know, if you're putting all of your eggs in one basket, that can be a really big problem for something that isn't something you're doing wrong as an organization, but your supplier can have a detrimental impact back onto you. And then looking at compliance, you know, again, the type of information that you're dealing with in particular is extremely sensitive. So looking at laws like GDPR and how that information is being handled and stored, you know, if you're sharing some of that information with a supplier or a provider and they get impacted and that information goes out into the world, while it's not you that leaked the information, that can still come back to your organization, because part of your due diligence would be to ensure that your suppliers are well equipped to keep that shared information as safe as you would sort of expect that you would be keeping it. And then, yeah, from a reputational standpoint, we know what the outcomes can be. And sometimes for organization, reputation can have the biggest impact across all four of these that we're looking at right now. And we'll take a look at that in just a sec. But so how do these risks actually arise? Where do they come from? And how can we identify them, right? So typically, supply chain risks emerge from people just not doing good due diligence, right? If you're taking on a supplier to provide you with services or anything of the likes, it really is up to you to do as much research as you can into that organization. And you have the absolute right to go down and ask them for evidence that they are securing their systems well enough to be able to transact and do business with you, right? because as this kind of goes on, you'll get the idea. The picture is that while you can do everything right in your own space, if you're relying on another provider to take sort of co-ownership or do part of that journey with your data and access to your systems, their failures on their end can have a direct impact to you. We spoke about having all your eggs in one basket, right? If you do have one provider that provides everything back to your care home and that provider is impacted, you know, what are your other options? Do you know what those are today? Do you have any idea of where you might go if one of your big suppliers does sort of just vanish tomorrow? And those are serious questions, because more and more so today, cyber attacks and the nature of everybody doing business online, and the sort of escalation of cyber risks and cyber threats out on the internet, they really do have the capacity to effectively just take a business completely offline, and sometimes not for hours or days, but for weeks and months. And then you've got to consider, right, like how long can you survive if one of your providers is just indefinitely unavailable and not able to deliver on their remit. And the third big thing here is that you can't really see your supplier's supply chain, which means you can only really rely on the fact that if you're dealing with a particular supplier, you're asking them all the right questions to find out, are they taking their own security, seriously? And have they considered asking the same of their supply chain? Because again, as we saw right at the beginning of the slide deck, that it doesn't even necessarily need to be somebody you're doing business with directly, but somebody sitting behind them, enabling them to deliver, can have that knock-on effect up the supply chain. So here's a really, really big profile of exactly this case. And this is sometimes where reputation can have a really big fallout from a commercial standpoint for M&S. So M&S, really big breach, really public. It wasn't M&S that were breached in the first instance. This was directly from a third-party supplier of M&S that had this huge impact on their business nationally, right? Even to the point that my mother in a different country was asking about M&S and what was going on with their business. It really did have a far-reaching sort of consequence in people's opinion. And, looking at the amount of money lost, not even directly from sales, but from customers choosing to take their business elsewhere, even for a short period of time, had a huge cost implication to Marks and Spencer. But yeah, very, very key to know that it wasn't even MS's direct negligence necessarily that led them down this path. It was one of their suppliers that caused the whole incident to unravel. So then it is, what if this does happen to you? Because that's M&S. M&S is maybe a completely different business, right? What are the things that you can sort of learn from these really big incidences to apply back to your business, right? If you had no access to your residence records, that can be really, really detrimental, right? If you're not even sure what it is that you need to be looking up for that particular person at a point in time, what is your fallback mechanisms? Do you go back to pen and paper? What does that really look like? For the CQC to be notified of a data breach, right? You're starting to tread across these lanes of not so much admitting failure, but you have to notify that there has been something that has gone wrong. That in itself can have a whole different set of consequences to your organization once you go down that route. And it is one of those requirements that if you do suffer a breach, you have to go through the formal legal processes that are defined. There will very likely be local press coverage, whether you would like to invite it or not. Local press, particularly in smaller towns, they will jump on absolutely anything that is newsworthy. Something that you certainly would like to avoid, I'm sure, at any costs. And then looking at the knock-on effect to NHS contracts being reviewed or pulled, depending on the severity of the breach, right? That might be a result of this third-party supply chain attack. So it really is quite a big picture thing when you start breaking it down to all its constituent parts, right? Third-party supply chain is not something that is too far away from your business to have impact, or it shouldn't be seen as something super overwhelming, but it can have a huge impact. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? We'll get to the good parts, I promise. Um, but here's just, again, one example of many. Closer to home in terms of your industry and where you sit, with Appetito, their impact was entirely third-party supply chain driven. But the impact to them was that they couldn't do deliveries, they couldn't contact their customers, they were effectively taken off the map for a period of time. Now, the actual harm that exists within that, outside of a business context, was the supply of food to people that really needed to get it, right? Meals on Wheels impacted schools that needed those meals delivered and prepared. People were literally going hungry from an incident that wasn't even directly related to the organization delivering the service. So these knock-on effects can be really detrimental. This might have even touched some of your organizations. I'm not too sure if any of you sort of would have been using Appetito at the time or in the past. You could have experienced this in real time. And down the right, we've just got, while I've been talking, a load of other examples. This is really to draw attention to the fact that 5 years ago, having this discussion, it was far more contained. There were far less incidences to refer back to. As time's moving forward with the advancements in artificial intelligence and how that's being turned against organizations and used for nefarious purposes, it's just enabling these types of attacks to happen more frequently than they ever have before. And I think that, incidentally, globally right now, that is a really big problem that everybody needs to be doing as much as what they can as their own organization, because they will most certainly, depending on where they sit and what they deliver, could have an impact on other organizations through this globally shared supply chain ecosystem. But what can you do about it? So there are some really basics on the ground steps that organizations and individuals can take. And really, one of the things that I say in just about every context and every speech that I ever do get to give, cybersecurity is not super complicated. What it really boils down to is a collection of basic hygiene, right? It's really simple habits that if every person just really does take care on their individual basis, that will expand up to a business level, and that will expand out to the communities that we exist in and serve. But so primarily as a business, what you can do is really do scrutinize your suppliers. Ask them the hard questions, ask them for proof that they are able to sustain, what their resilience is, what happens if they get impacted, are they still able to operate and deliver on what they say they're delivering? And really do take time in putting that vetting in place. That ties directly into don't rely on one supplier. Diversify your supply chain as far as you possibly can. Both to just, I think it does open itself up for, if you've always used one supplier and they're always delivering one thing and that is just what it is, there's a good chance you might be missing out on a better service or a better supplier somewhere else. But it has that sort of tie-in effect to, if one gets impacted, they're delivering everything, it can be a big problem for you. Knowing your fourth parties is slightly more difficult, but it is exactly that, right? Asking your suppliers to detail their supply chain so you get a bit of an understanding of their knowledge of their business. And that should be a really good baseline for you to say that, well, if they can define and give you assurances that whoever supplies them to deliver their remit to you, that you can rely on that business to deliver what they need to, so you can carry on and do what you do on a day-to-day. And then continually monitor this. It's certainly not a once-off exercise. This should be baked into the processes of a business on a day-to-day, month-to-month basis. Always be doing these checks. It really just goes a long way to assuring your existence post a breach in your chain. And yeah, as I'd said, it all comes down to the good habits. So on an individual level, use a strong password. Use a unique password for every account. a simple tip on this is, rather than going for these big complex numbers and symbols and letters combinations, pick 3 or 4 words and just group those together, right? Create a phrase. Phrases are actually harder to crack as a password than just random numbers and letters, strangely enough. So get into a good habit of defining strong passwords. Don't reuse them as far as you possibly can. That is probably the number one cause of where things start to go wrong. Um, Turn on two-factor authentication, 2FA, or multi-factor authentication, it might be called, and depending on the services that you use. If it is available as a feature, enable it. If everything goes wrong at the password level and your password does get in the hands of the wrong people, two-factor authentication can at least be that second door, second gate that will stop people from accessing your data directly. Certainly, if it's available, do turn it on. Most services these days are required to have two-factor authentication available on their services, and they should do. Number 3, don't click unexpected links. This comes down to basic hygiene, right? It's always a strange one to me that if people just kept on knocking on your door, eventually you're really going to be looking through that keyhole before you just open the door and find out who's on the other side, right? Emails that just arrive in your inbox, if it's not from somebody that you're expecting to get an email from, just don't click it, right? Or really scrutinize it at the very least. If it has got links embedded in there, I'm always wary of links in emails. There's almost no reason for me to have to get that unless it's something I'm really, really expecting. I know who's going to be sending it, but I can have a little bit of sort of relaxed approach to that. But in all other examples, email is the number one most abused medium to sort of deliver nasty things. So always scrutinize your emails. If it's from a person you don't recognize just from the name, just drop it into your trash. Lock your screen when you step away from your machine. I was actually in town, not this weekend, the weekend past, at a coffee shop and watched a person literally working on their laptop stand up and go to the loo. And their machine was just open on their table. These things happen in everyday life, and that is absolutely shocking because that can directly lead to information of yours being stolen, accounts being taken over. It just really is a terrible thing. So always lock your device when you're not using it. Keep your software and apps updated. Sometimes this is easier said than done, but in most instances, if there is an update available for software you're using, the reason it typically gets updates is to enhance the security and make sure that that software is safe to use. Going on to trusted Wi-Fi. Using Wi-Fi anywhere in an open area is typically a not great option. If you can tether it to your mobile phone if you're out and about, that's probably a better option. But if you are using open Wi-Fi at a restaurant or a hotel or anything of the likes, make use of a VPN. There are huge amounts of good VPN providers out there. They don't cost the earth, and it really does go a long way to ensuring that the communications that you're sending over the internet, or at least within that connection that you're making to that wireless system, is secure. And obviously think before you plug anything in. If you do find a USB stick out in the parking lot, I can almost guarantee you it's there to steal your information. It is not there to give you anything interesting to look at. So just avoid plugging things that you're not sure of into your machines, any USB sticks or cables, anything like that. And then be careful what you share on social media. It is quite interesting when you start going down the topics of what you can find out about a person by just looking at their social media habits and what they post. As you might hear, I'm not from the UK, I'm from South Africa. And one of the first sort of things that made me really think differently on social media was the fact that it was being used by criminals to target houses that they could break into. And it really starts to become something super easy to pay attention to when you see a family that's now gone on holiday because they've just posted that they're in a different country. that's fantastic because they've probably posted something around their house or in their neighborhood. If you paid a little bit of attention, you could work out exactly where they live and you would know that nobody's home. So, what a great way to go and take advantage of that. Um, something that a load of people don't seem to really think, but social media is probably the single point of access that criminals will start looking at first if they want to target an individual. If they can tailor an email that speaks to your interests because you've shared it on Facebook, that's exactly what they would do, right? Is collect that shared interest, give you an email that might land, and you think, yeah, that's something that I might want to click on, even though you think you shouldn't. Um, Always be aware of that. And then report anything suspicious, whether it be to security teams inside your organization or any authorities, depending on the severity. Always report anything suspicious, right? There's no silly questions, I think, on any sort of front when it comes to business, and particularly in cyber, more so today than ever before, because of the rate of change, right? Everything is almost new every other week. So certainly keep your eyes out and do speak about it if something's happened that you have a bad feeling about. And then log out of accounts when you're done, right? Just like you would do with your banking app. People have typically got really good habits around that. If you use your banking, you make sure it's closed and you pay attention when you're using the banking app. I'd say extend that through to every other service that you're using. It's in your best interest to do so. So I know that I've read those out and you probably read them through before I even finished point one. But just to talk these over, these are the fundamentals. If you can get this right, you're probably going to go a long way in protecting yourself. And if your whole company is taking these basic steps, your organization is going to be in a far better place than it was. And really, that takes us to the end. So thank you very, very much. And